We only have one camera. You don't need to do that.
It's true. You are both unkind.
Well, hey, whoa, I'm in the house. Hey, online family, good to see you today. We're so glad that you're here watching from wherever you're watching from, whether you're on Facebook, Church Online, or on YouTube. We're just glad that you've joined us today. We're in week 2 of our series, The Bible for Grownups. And today, Pastor Jen has got a great message called The Beginning. And I'm excited that you're here today. So we're going to worship together in just a little bit, and then Pastor Jen's going to continue that series. We want to hear from you and make sure that we can connect, help you take that next step. So go to cc.ashleyridgechurch.org. There you'll find the Connect card, and let us know what prayer requests you have. Let us know if maybe you want to jump in a small group or learn more about following Jesus or take that next step of baptism, whatever that looks like for you. We want to help you do that from wherever you are. So if you have the Ashley Ridge app, that Connect card's right there on the homepage, along with the song lyrics we're going to be singing today and some other helpful information, or you can go to cc.ashleyridgechurch.org and fill it out there. I'm so glad that you're here today. You've still got time to invite a friend, so invite somebody, text them right now and say, hey, join me at live.ashleyridgechurch.org for church. Y'all, I'm so glad that you're here today. Thank you for the ways that you continue to help this ministry function and reach even more people with the message that God is for them. If you want to partner with us financially, you can text any amount to 84321, or you can go to give.ashleyridgechurch.org and do it there. We love you guys. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. See you then. Well, good morning, y'all. Welcome to Ashley Ridge. I'm James. Y'all see him. We're going to sing together this morning. I was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry that kind of a weight? It was my turn till I met you. I was breathing but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. It was my turn till I met you. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. Now your mercy has saved my soul. Now your freedom is all that I know. The old made new, yeah. Jesus, when I met you, when you called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. Let's lift this up together, church. I needed rescue. Let's sing. I needed rescue. My sin was heavy, but chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter. I was an orphan. Now you call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing. Now your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future. My eyes are open. 'Cause when you called my name, I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. I saw Satan fall like lightning. I saw darkness run for cover. But the miracle that I just can't get over, my name is registered in heaven. I believe in signs and wonders. I have resurrection power. Yes, I do. that I just can't get over. My name is registered in heaven. Oh, my praise belongs to you forever. We sing. This is my testimony from death to life. 'Cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify. By Jesus Christ the righteous, I'm justified. This is my testimony. This is my testimony. Yeah. Come together, sons, and sing the praises of the Spirit, Son, and Father. Yeah. Oh. Still the greater things still to come. Oh, I believe if I'm not dead, then you're not done. Greater things still to come. Oh, I believe. Hey. This is my testimony from death to life. 'Cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify. By Jesus Christ the righteous, I'm justified. This is my testimony. Oh, I'm alive. This is my testimony from death to life. 'Cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify. By Jesus Christ the righteous, I'm justified. This is my testimony. This is my testimony. We come to this place with joy, with expectation that we serve a living God who meets us here. Y'all, let's sing together this last one. We worship the God who was. We worship the God who is. We worship the God who evermore will be. He opened the prison doors. He parted the raging sea. My God, He holds the victory. Yeah. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet. We shout out in praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's God to show the end this place. And we won't be quiet. We shout out in praise. Oh, 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 oh. We sing to the God who heals. We sing to the God who saves. We sing to the God who always makes a way. 'Cause He hung up on that cross. Then He rose up from that grave, and my God's still rolling stones away. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today, and we won't be quiet. We shout out in praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is sure the end is place, and we won't be quiet. We shout out in praise. 'Cause we were the beggars, now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise. Come on, church. 'Cause we were the beggars, now we're royalty. We're gonna shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. And we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. Oh, oh, oh. We shout out your praise. There is joy in this house. There is joy in this house today. We shout out your praise. We shout out your praise. Amen. Y'all can be seated this morning. We're so glad that you're here.
That was a workout, y'all. That was good. There is joy in this place today. And here's the deal. Some of you are brand new. And to you, I want to say welcome. I'm Jen, and we are so thrilled that you found us here today. Some of you are not new, but maybe in this last month or so, you have found your way back to this place. And here's what's been really cool, is that it has felt a little bit like a mini family reunion every single Sunday since the start of May. Every Sunday, I've seen faces that I haven't seen for a while, and it's just such a big deal. It's just such a big deal that we get to see each other and encourage each other just by being in this place. Where the house of the Lord is, there is God, and there's joy, and there's hope. Well, today is our very first Family First Sunday. And this is something different that we are doing. Allows our kids to get in these ideas and play with them, and our students, and also our adults. And so what we do on most weeks around here is we do head to these different environments where we get to worship and celebrate on those levels. But then there's another thing that we believe about family ministry. And it's that the best way to grow a child's faith is to grow a parent's faith. And so it's a big deal to us that we are consistently putting tools into the hands of all of our parents. And maybe you're not even a parent of a current, be people who are helping you explore your faith in a way that's going to translate to them. And so when we gather in this space, and when we encourage you get into those small groups where you can dig in, that's for you to grow in your faith, talking to the big people here. But it's also because we believe that as you grow, the ones following you grow. But the third thing that I believe and that we do in our kids ministry, from the very beginning, we've had a mission statement that we want to partner with families to raise kids who love Jesus and love his church. We want to partner with families. And one of the things that we experienced in those months that we were worshiping outside all together, and then even once we came inside to the cafeteria and we couldn't split out into all these places, is that in a way we had never experienced before, we saw parents of our elementary age kids who were really, by force of the situation, their kids' small group leaders on Sundays. And what that did was it carried into the week. And we started hearing these amazing stories about the conversations that began around those games and activities and stories that carried into your homes, into your prayer time with your kids. And so what we're doing on these Family First Sundays is finding a way to embrace a little bit of that. And so what's going to happen right now is AR students, 6th through 12th graders, y'all get out of here. Y'all go like you normally do. They are never hesitant to get out of here. I can't even get mine to sit in the front with me. He stays in the back so that he is fully ready. But our 6th through 12th graders, just like they do every week, they're heading out with their small group leaders where they get to spend their time in small group and studying together. But now the other group that I want to send from this place today, and I hope, even though I'm kicking you out today, I hope you come back next week, and we'll be back in here again today. But if you are an elementary student, kindergarten through fifth, and if you are the family of a kindergarten through fifth grader, then y'all need to get up right now and head to the cafeteria where the party is getting started. So y'all head that direction. And for the rest of you that are in here, well, you're stuck with me, so let's have some fun.
The B-I-B-L-E, yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word of God, the B-I-B-L-E.
The B-I-B-L-E, yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word of God, the B-I-B-L-E.
The B-I-B-L-E, yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word.
On. I always loved that one because it's how I learned the word regurgitated. That served me well the rest of life. And then you learn some of the stories about any number of things. Moses in the burning bush, Noah and the ark, the Tower of Babel. And these are these great stories that give us so much of the framework for what we believe and who we are. But there's something that happens as adults. Suddenly, as adults, it becomes a little bit more important and interesting and relevant to us where this book actually came from. Because if we're going to interact with the Bible, if we're going to believe the Bible, if we're going to live our lives by so many of the truths and the things that we point to in that place, then we start asking the next question, which is, where did this come from? Where did this show up? How did this get put together? Because it's only once we understand that we can, as adults, dig back into the stories that are found in there. And so last week, Andy Stanley, not in person, but on the screen, set up this series, and he did such a phenomenal job explaining the fact that the Bible, as you and I, verse numbers and chapter numbers, that version of the Bible is so very different from where the Bible began. In fact, in our bound copies, one of the most immediate illustrations of this is that in every copy of our Bible, it starts in Genesis. But the truth is, the Bible, as we know it, started coming together around this early first century when people started writing their accounts of what it had been to walk with and know and learn from Jesus. And so we had people like Luke and people like John Mark, who wrote down Peter's account. People like Matthew, who was speaking directly to his Jewish family. And then people like John, who waited a little bit longer and made a much more theological argument, for lack of a better word. He skipped the birth story and those kinds of things and went straight to the point to talk about who was this Jesus that he had been able to spend time with. And it was as these accounts were written, it started to really allow all of these people who had been hearing about Jesus to start to fill in the blanks. As they had heard about Jesus, as the disciples and people like Paul spread out throughout the Roman Empire, telling these stories of what had been experienced in this one small corner of the world, they started to hear these things, but they were longing for more. And so these accounts that started to be written down were these treasured and valuable things. And then you added to those these letters that were being passed back and forth between the churches about how to understand what they were reading and what that looked like for them. And so much of that, and we're going to come back to some of that in another couple weeks, is what we know of today as the New Testament. But that's really where the Bible started. Only the craziest thing is that we get a very different version today, because when people started to hear the story of Jesus and they were enamored by this story of Jesus, then suddenly Jesus' death and resurrection made his teachings more interesting. There were a lot of people that showed up to hear Jesus teach while he was alive, and some of them were captivated and some of them were on the edge waiting for some extra bread and fish, and they didn't know what to make of this Jesus guy and what he was talking about. In fact, even the people that were captivated after Jesus was crucified on the cross, they were kind of like, I guess it didn't really matter. Only when Jesus rose from the dead, because that was new, because he predicted it, because he said it would happen, suddenly everything he taught had become that much more interesting. And Jesus' teaching is what made the Jewish scriptures more interesting. Suddenly a whole group of people who before couldn't have cared less what this minority population of Jews believed or talked about. They didn't really care all that much about their God, but because Jesus had done what he had done and taught what he had taught and sacrificed his very life, then suddenly the fact that he was Jewish and the fact that he grew up in this worldview became so much more interesting than it had been before, which is how we ended up at the beginning in a story. This is important, is that this only became part of the story because of Jesus. In fact, that word Genesis that we know as the beginning, Genesis is the Greek word for origin. It is not a Hebrew word. For what were these connecting pieces that got us to Jesus? And so today as a territory, right? Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens. That most of us, when you hear someone just refer to the creation story, you don't think twice before taking your mind directly to Genesis 1, the creation day when it was the heavens and the earth, and then there were the sun and the stars, and there was the fish, and all of these different things that we know to be the creation story. But I very clearly remember my first week in seminary. My very first week in seminary, where it was as though they were collectively on a mission to destroy everything I thought I knew about how this whole thing worked. And so day one, I walked into a Greek class where I learned that I was going to need to know the whole alphabet for a test tomorrow. And then that was really annoying because my husband, who did the Greek life in college, I remember calling him on the phone. He wasn't my husband yet. He was living in a different state. And I called him all panicked that night. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is an ancient language. And I got to learn the whole alphabet in one night. And he's like, I can do it in a flick of a match. Some of you, this was your college experience too. You can do the Greek alphabet in the flicker of a match. And so he showed off over the phone how he could do this. And meanwhile, I panicked. But that wasn't the only thing I was panicking about. I was also panicking about the fact that I walked into an Old Testament class feeling relatively confident as a preacher's kid that I had this thing down. Like I knew all about how we were going to go from Genesis to Abraham, and we were going to get all these stories, and I was ready to rock and roll. Only I walked in on the first day, and my professor walked in with two things. She walked in with a Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. She straight up would translate as she taught. It was unbelievable, but she showed up with her Hebrew Bible and then copies of all of these other ancient creation accounts. There was an Egyptian creation account and a Babylonian creation account, and there was a Canaanite creation account, and there were all these different creation accounts that she handed us, and as we started to read it, it was like, what? In Genesis, This is a very common experience that happens. In fact, I remember when some of you will remember Devon, who was our intern and then on staff, but I remember when he headed off to his first week of seminary, without fail, he calls me day one, Jen, why didn't anybody tell me about all these other creation accounts? I feel like I've been lied to, right? And I laughed, thinking, I know exactly where you are. But it also made me think, okay, I don't want to be responsible for not passing along this whole experience. This fact that we learned actually not until the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered these books and these documents in ancient libraries. And there was one in particular, the Babylonian creation account was found in this ancient ruins of a library in Nineveh. I've talked about our friend Jonah today. You remember? Jonah was supposed to go to Nineveh, and he tried to go to Tarshish first. But Nineveh, at ruins, they found these books and documents that period of time in history. All right, now this is pretty fascinating stuff. Some of you are trying to fall asleep. Don't. Some of you, this is like the really good stuff. So if you're into history, follow me here. And so it blew my mind, as it did the archaeologists and the scientists at the time, who went, this changes everything. And the immediate assumption that they began to make is that the Hebrews had borrowed their account of creation from so many of these other ancient stories. There were some similarities in the number of days. There were some similarities in the order of creation. And so for a while, as everybody tried to get, however, in the last century, as these historic and scientific studies have continued, that assumption has actually been abandoned. And so here's where you can go read. You can get totally off the beaten path of people who would consider themselves to be Christians, but there is this wide historic and scientific view, no matter where your worldview is, that these documents were actually not so much borrowed from each other, in the sense that the Hebrew version actually shows up in very stark contrast to these other stories about creation. It was so ahead of its time. The idea that creation had a beginning, we take for granted in this day and age. But it was absolutely unbelievable at the time, because the modern scientific community didn't catch up with that kind of idea until 1927, when a Belgian priest introduced a little something called the Big Bang Theory. Y'all ever heard of it? Just check in, see, like this is a lot of science. Some of you might be drifting on me, okay? All right, 1927, a Belgian priest introduces this scientific idea of the Big Bang Theory. And what was crazy about it at the time for the modern scientific community is that from the time of Aristotle, it had been assumed by that community that creation and that the world as we knew it had always been in some form. This was a brand new idea that the universe had a beginning. But from the time that this theory, that scientific hypothesis, was thrown into the mix, scientists began to re-examine this underlying philosophical belief that they had held, that the universe had always existed, and started to really lean into this idea that somewhere it had to begin. And if somewhere it began, then it had to have a cause. And so in 1964, these cosmic microwave background radiation, okay? And when they got to that, the view that the universe had always existed was entirely abandoned by the scientific community. And the debate today is whether it was a personal, purposeful, and intentional cause. The agreement, only recently, is that there wasn't in the beginning. Genesis had it right. The debate is whether it was personal, purposeful, and intentional. All right, so that was the rabbit trail. Come back in with me. This is where, as we start to look at these ancient creation accounts, we start to get this clear separation of this radical monotheistic worldview that was the worldview that shaped what Jesus then taught into. And where we often don't fully connect the two, when we go back and understand that this is where they started to go back and understand Jesus' teaching connected to these ideas, it started to look a little different. Now, Moses is commonly understood to have been the one who at some point wrote down these first 5 books of the Bible. Whether he did it by himself, we don't know. But there's a common understanding about that. But what we've learned over time and what we've come to believe when we look at how we got the Bible is that Moses was far less interested in explaining how God created the world. Instead of what he really wanted to explain was that God created the world. You see, in a time when people didn't even know there was a beginning, Moses was trying to explain this God that he had encountered in this universe that had been built. And so when he sits down to tell this story that we believe has just been inspired and led the whole way through by God wanting us to know more, which is really cool. Moses had this whole thing where he was making an argument and he was sharing this incredible story that God was the one who created the world. And when we look at it in contrast to these other creation narratives, what we start to see is that God did it on purpose, which we're going to get with each other. Here's some of it, just because I don't think many of you are going to go to your library today. Big battle of the gods on his horses that were named Slaughterer and Merciless. All right? So here's Marduk, and he rides in on Slaughterer and Merciless, and according to the Babylonian myth, Marduk defeated the goddess Tiamat by shooting an arrow through her mouth, and then afterwards split her body in half, and he created the heavens with the upper half of her body, and earth with the lower half of her body. Their children's stories were very different from the Jewish boys and girls, okay? Because these Jewish children learned that God created the heavens and the earth in this creative capacity of wanting to do these amazing things. But in so many of these other accounts, it was this incidental byproduct of violence. It was a war between the gods, to see who would ultimately reign supreme. And the reason it's so important is because there is this absolute foundational point of our faith that Jesus pointed again and again and again to the fact that God made you and God is for you, which is why ultimately God will move heaven and earth out of the way to get to you. You were not an accident. You were not an accident. This world was not an accident. God did it on purpose. Which leads us to this second huge contrast between this creation narrative that we have and all of these other creation narratives. And it's that in the creation account in Genesis, humanity has a purpose. Right? If we move on in this Genesis to verse 26, in this creation account, it says, "Let us make mankind in our image, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all." There's this account that then continues on in Genesis 2, where we understand that God had a purpose for humanity. He wanted us to partner with him in creation. We were given a role. We were given an opportunity to live in this dynamic relationship with both God and the world around us. And the reason that was so different is then in all of these other accounts, humanity's only purpose, having been incidentally created as a byproduct, was to serve the gods so that they could be lazy and settle into a life of ease. All right, so again, here's more of the Babylonian story. Y'all, your friends are going to ask what you learned in church today. It's going to be so much fun, okay? So in the Babylonian story, after Marduk becomes the chief among all the gods, this is what he says. He says, I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Savage man I will create, and he shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease. In every other worldview, humanity was meaningless. They were a tool that was to be at the disposal of the gods so the gods could kick back and care less. But then the God of creation, as Moses is trying to give this account, he's like, no, this is actually a big deal. Mankind in his own image, in the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. In the image of God himself, he created us. In every other worldview, because humanity was a byproduct and had no value and had no purpose, humanity was not valued. They were born out of violence and expected to kill themselves eventually in their own violence. They were an afterthought meant to lighten the loads of the gods with no hope and no rights. Whereas God, all the way back in the beginning, when he created humanity, he created humanity with this value and this intrinsic dignity that came from saying, I will make them in my very own image. That is a bananas worldview. We take it for granted. We take it for granted because this is the story of creation that succeeded. Whether you've believed it before or not, this is the only version of creation that until somewhat recently the world has known because it's the one whose story pushed through. But when we go back to the beginning and we take it for what it is, this is insane. This is insane that from the beginning, God creates us in his own image, and this extraordinary value was given to men and women in the beginning. What? We can't figure this one out today. We're all over the place. From the very beginning, God said, if nothing else, look upon one another as children made on purpose by the living God. That's who you are. You are sons. You are daughters of God. You were made on purpose for a purpose, and there is value in who you are because God made it so. So I hope, as I'm talking about this, that where your mind is starting to go is back to Jesus, right? Because these things only made it through the woodworks, so to speak, because Jesus did this extraordinary thing that because he lived, it changed so much of what was understood. And as they went back and looked at this again and they thought about the fact that Jesus went out of his way to recognize the people that were around him. Jesus spoke about loving one another as God had loved us, and all of it went back to this completely radical worldview that God had made us to be loved. God had made us with this kind of extraordinary value. And so if I can summarize really quickly, and then I promise I'm getting to a close here. This is really fascinating, and I could talk about this for a long time. But if I could summarize just a little bit, if we go back to then, with worldviews that are different from the one we hold with our faith. You have these worldviews of the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Canaanites that essentially say you were born a slave to serve the gods, and there is no redeemer and there is no afterlife. It is what it is. You ended up here, and one day you'll die. And then if we fast forward to today, you have a worldview that's held by people that we would consider the new atheists. And it's fascinating, and it's worth investigating and understanding these different worldviews and these different thought patterns. But the way it plays out is that you were born a slave to your DNA with no free will and no redeemer and no afterlife. These are the worldviews that are out there that stand in stark contrast to the worldview that Jesus made real, to the worldview that went all the way back to the beginning, a worldview introduced in Genesis that instead says, you were born on purpose. You were born with free will, value, and dignity ascribed to you by God Himself. We were given freedom to choose and a God who honors our choices, and ultimately a God who would work on our behalf to reverse the consequences of those choices because He refused that we would perish, but instead made it possible to have everlasting life. Whew. This is worth talking about, right? This is a different worldview. This is so different, and we let ourselves get pulled into these ideas that it's not that radical and it's not that revolutionary because we've maybe heard it our whole lives, but this is a radical, monotheistic worldview, and it answers big questions like why we're here and why it matters. And those are questions that maybe you don't consider yourself a deep philosophical person, but I think at some point or other, at some time or another, we all start to ask those questions. Why are we here? And why does it matter? I had an 11th grader sitting in my office 2 weeks ago with her notebook in hand, racking her brain. Why are we here? Why does it matter? And y'all, these are the big questions, and they're worth pondering, and they're worth thinking about, and they're worth exploring, and they're worth asking. And when you ask them, I hope that you will consider this radical, before its time, but right on time worldview that was introduced in Genesis, but made so incredibly clear by this Jew from Nazareth who showed up and gave his life for the world. For this world, for these people that mattered so very much to God. Because Jesus rose from the dead, the Jewish worldview became interesting and it became relevant, and it turns out revolutionary, even from the beginning. At least that was the conclusion that the first century Gentiles came to. If we go back to where we started, this whole conversation we're having that we're going to continue next week, where did we get this Bible? Is that the first century Gentiles began hearing this story of Jesus. And in hearing this story of Jesus and in hearing these teachings of Jesus, they began to reconsider this Jewish worldview and these things that had been told by the law and the prophets. And what they decided was that the Jews were right. What they decided is they did the work, and as they asked the questions and they tried to make sense of this man who would give everything for people who betrayed him. They went, what if they were right? That we weren't an accident. That God did this incredible thing on purpose, and it changes who we are and how we interact with the world around us. And so in their interest in the law and the prophets, what began to happen in the first several centuries is as they began to compile these accounts of Jesus' life and as they began to pull together these letters that were being passed between the early churches, they also started to incorporate these Hebrew scriptures, these stories that began with this radical in the beginning worldview. And eventually we would get to what we have today as this story of who our God is, Not enough to understand how he does it all and why he does it all, but enough to understand that our God created the heavens and the earth. Our God created you and me, and he did it on purpose. And he said that we were in his image, and that we had value, and that there was nothing he wouldn't do to chase us to the very ends of the universe, which coincidentally, I believe, are also marked by the living God. Next week, we're going to get back together and we're going to talk about the fact that it was not without a little bit of mess that the Hebrew scriptures and the story of Jesus came together. But I hope that what you see as we talk about this is that there's so much more there than just stories. There's so much more there than just this idea of the birds of the sea and the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. There's a God who's been intentionally at work on our behalf. That's the story of the Bible. Let me pray for us. God, I'm praying that we become and are and continue to be people who search. People who ask questions and people who look for discoveries and at some point along the way come to trust that the one we are searching and pursuing above all else is you. The one who created us and knows us. The one who has not just the whole world in his purview, but our lives in his hands. That you are for us, that you are with us, that it's your desire to share this life with us, because that's what it's been since the very beginning. God, thank you that you made that so clear when you sent Jesus, that you showed us how far you would go, that we could know who you are. And so, God, make us journeyers, make us discoverers, make us people eager to follow after you, to see you more clearly, to know you in all of the realms of all of our life. It is in the name of Jesus, who made this all make sense. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. Y'all, as we head out today, if you'd like to pray with someone, our prayer team's in the hallway. If you have a gift you'd like to give, there are offering buckets in all four corners of this room. But this is a gift that we get to come to the house of the Lord, that we get to celebrate and sing and remember who he is. Next week, we'll be back here together. We're going to let the rest of the people stay in the room with us next week, and we're going to continue this conversation. But until then, I hope y'all have a great week. Thanks, Ron. Hey, y'all, if you are joining with us online today, we are so excited that you are with us. If you are local, we hope that you'll find a time soon that you can come and worship with us in this space on a Sunday morning at 10 a.m. If you are not local, what a gift that we have the internet and that we get to do this together even from a distance. We want to help you take a next step. We want to pray with you and for you if you have a prayer need. So you can fill out a Connect card directly online, either in our Ashley Ridge Church app, or if you're watching in church online, there's a button right there at the top. Let us know how we can walk with you in these days. Thank you so much for joining us.